biodiversity in our last lesson 1.8, which is some review. So if you were about to do a test or you just finished studying this unit and you wanted to consolidate a little bit or just refresh yourself on it, then I'm just going to go through quickly what we learned in each of the lessons and then some quick multiple choice questions for you to do at the end. Okay, so if you remember all the way back in lesson 1, we started talking about, well, what is biodiversity? And we concluded that biodiversity was the variety of life that we have on our Earth. Well, if we have all this variety, we needed a way to classify it and how to break it down further so that we can stay organized. Well, very famous scientists came up with taxonomy, which is the list that we're looking at here and all the different taxa. So we have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, and this is a list that you're going to become very familiar with. So the two domains that we talked about the most were eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And if you go back to the lesson 1 video, you can see how we break those down and the differences between them. And essentially, it said that eukaryotes evolved from prokaryotes. Next, we looked at the different kingdoms. So we looked at kingdom Plantae, kingdom Fungi, kingdom Protista, and kingdom Animalia. We also broke down all of those kingdoms' individual phylums as well as those phylums' classes. And the bottom one that we finally have down there in pink is species. And there are millions, hundreds of millions species on our Earth, and we're finding more each day. So that was the main gist of what lesson 1 was about. Lesson 2, we kind of went away from the classification a little bit and we started talking about the different viruses. So if you remember, we started learning about that little rocket ship there and how it goes through the different cycles. So it goes through the lactic and the lysogenic cycles. And so essentially what happens is the rocket ship either infects the cell and it has too many, so the cell lyses and it lets one escape and it keeps infecting more and more and more. For the lysogenic cycle, the same thing happens, but it's a little bit similar to mitosis or meiosis where it actually splits and it keeps reproducing by cell division. And then we also talked a little bit about vaccines and how when you get a vaccine, you're injected with a little bit of a detonated virus, so your body is able to produce antibodies to fight the virus off. Our next lesson, we went a little bit back to the classifications and we started looking at kingdom Protista or Protists. And then we broke it down into the different phylums, so animal-like, plant-like, and fungus-like. And this is just a little consolidation of all the things that we learn. So animal life take in food from their environment, so they're heterotrophs. Plant-like produce food by photosynthesis, which we learned are what means is autotrophs. And then the fungus-like can be decomposers or parasites and things like that. The next lesson that we started studying was kingdom fungi. And this one we also took a look at the different phylum and some examples of the phylum. So of course we started off with the domain, which is eukarya, and then the kingdom, fungi, and then broke it down into its 4 phylum: Zygomycota, Basidiomycota, Ascomycota, and Chytridimycota. So then the first one, I gave you some examples. So we have like case-like spores, so in little like clusters, so like common house molds. The next one was club-like spores, so it makes that little dome shape like a mushroom. The next one is sac-like spores, so like yeast. And then the last one is flagellated spores. Lesson 5, we also started looking at kingdom Archaea bacteria. So this one, I started to give you sort of a side-by-side comparison of bacteria and Archaea bacteria, which are 2 other domains that you do look at. So if you break down bacteria, you see that's very similar to Archaea. The only difference is we classify bacteria as eubacteria and Archaea as Archaea bacteria. And they're both prokaryotes. And both unicellular. And lesson 6, was we looked at kingdom Plantae. So then we started to get a little bit more complex, where we did have lots of phylum and lots of little sub things that we needed to break down. But all the phylum are written in red there for you to go over, and you can also go back to the other PowerPoint if you want some keywords or some pictures to help you identify which ones are which. Main thing from this lesson that we got was the spore producing and the seed producing, and we knew that seed producing broke down into gymnosperms and angiosperms. So angiosperms then also break down into monocots and dicots, which we will learn about later on in our plant unit. Another really important thing that we learned about is how plants reproduce, so through asexual and sexual reproduction, either by pollination, or their seed gets carried off and carried through the wind or the water, or an animal eats the fruit, and it is, when it excretes it out, it then plants it. So all those different types of things connect back into kingdom Plantae. And then the last one is kingdom Animalia, which is a lot of different types of phylum and a lot of different types of classes, but essentially these are the different types of phylum that you would have to know. And if you wanted a little bit more detail on each of the phylum, you could go back to the video and watch that. And we also went into a little bit of detail of some examples of things, so like roundworms, segmented worms, and flatworms. We also went into things like mollusca, which are things with shells, and then we also talked about phylum Chordata, which is like the most broad one and the one that we think about most when we think of things that are considered animals, so like mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, things like that. And this is also one of the largest kingdoms and hardest to classify. Okay, so now we're going to do a quick multiple choice, and I'm just going to give you a few seconds to answer that. You can pause the video and you can start answering them. Okay, so for our first one, before biologists can classify a newly discovered organism, he or she must carefully study its structure. And we know that from how we started looking at things like radial symmetry and stuff like that. Which category contains the greatest number of different kinds of organisms? Well, you can see here, if we go all the way back to our list, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, the one that has the most different types of organisms will actually be phylum. Because if you remember all those times that we broke it down, phylum did actually have the most different types. Which of these categories of classification contains organisms that are most closely related? So the way I like to think of these is, which is the closest to the bottom? So if we think about kingdom, phylum, class, check off, family, check off, order, genus, and then genus is the most one closest to the bottom, which makes sense because the closer you are to the bottom of that list that we made, the more things you're going to have in common with those organisms. Which of the following domains does not contain prokaryotes? So, of course, the only one that would be the correct answer here is eukarya, because you can't have prokaryotes in eukarya. And then bacteria that die in the presence of oxygen would be considered obligate anaerobes. And we didn't necessarily talk about this a little bit, but anaerobes are basically, anytime you see the word ana in front of it, that means that they don't do it. So that's just something to think about. And overall, then we are finished learning about biodiversity.